In a world where righteousness is often blurred by duty, there are those who believe their actions are guided by the light, when in truth, their silence casts the darkest of shadows. Father Michael Nolan was one such man, a priest who spent his life counseling the lost, offering guidance to the broken. He prided himself on his vows, on his devotion to the church. But when faced with the suffering of those most vulnerable, he chose inaction over justice. This is the story of a man who thought he was good, a man who believed his choices were righteous. But when the consequences of those choices came to light, Father Nolan finds himself in a place where the truth cannot be denied. And so, in the sterile and unforgiving halls of the afterlife, his journey begins. A journey that will force him to walk in the shoes of those he failed to protect, to face the darkness he ignored, and to seek a redemption that may be beyond his reach. Complicit is My Shepherd by NoSleep scribe. Father Michael Nolan stood in the small office, staring at the pile of paperwork on his desk. It had been another long day, another case, another name, another set of accusations. He rubbed his temples, trying to push back the fatigue that seemed to weigh on his every movement. His eyes drifted to the report in front of him. The 6th allegation against Father Alexander Hale. He had been through this too many times before. Too many accusations, each followed by a quiet reassignment, a short time in another parish, then back again. The cycle had repeated itself, yet the damage always lingered, festering under the surface. The door creaked open, and Father Nolan turned to see his mentor, Father John Avery, step inside. A seasoned priest, Father Avery had been the one to guide him when he first entered the ministry. He was always calm, collected, and persuasive, qualities that had earned him the respect of his peers. "You wanted to speak with me?" Father Avery's voice was measured, his tone soothing. It always had a way of putting Nolan at ease, even in moments like this when everything felt so heavy. "Yes," Nolan said, gesturing to the report on his desk. "It's Hale again. 6th allegation. Same story, same pattern. I'm not sure what more I can do." Father Avery took a seat across from Nolan, his gaze lingering on the report for a moment before he met Nolan's eyes. "I've read the report," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "And I know you're feeling conflicted. But Michael, you must understand. It's still just a child's word against a priest's. There's no proof, no physical evidence. The church has been through this before, and we know how these things play out." Nolan's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of his mentor's words pressing down on him. He had heard them before. They were part of the system, part of the reasoning that kept everything in place. But something in his gut told him that this wasn't enough anymore. "But this time," Nolan began, his voice wavering. "This time the allegations are starting to pile up. 6 separate children. We can't keep moving him around like this. The pattern is obvious." Father Avery raised a hand, silencing him before he could continue. "I know it's difficult, but as long as there's no proof, we cannot make a judgment. You know this as well as I do. Moving him to a different parish is still the right choice. It's a temporary solution, but it's all we can do. We protect the reputation of the church first, Michael. You mustn't forget that. The words stung. Father Nolan had heard them countless times, but now they felt colder. The guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong. His mind flashed back to the faces of the children, vulnerable, scared, and he couldn't silence the whispers in the back of his mind that told him the truth was being ignored. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Nolan said, his voice cracking slightly. Father Avery leaned forward, his tone softening. You are doing this, Michael. You've always done what's best for the church. Don't let doubt cloud your judgment. You are a good man. You are following the path laid out for you. Father Nolan wanted to believe him. He did believe him. At least he had. But now the words felt hollow. He looked down at the report again, the names and dates swimming before his eyes. It wasn't just about procedure anymore. He could feel the weight of his own conscience pressing down on him. There's more to this, isn't there? Nolan whispered, barely audible. Father Avery's gaze softened. There's always more, Michael, but the truth isn't always clear. The church stands above the individual. We do what we must for the greater good, and you will do what is right. Father Michael Nolan stood in the center of the sterile, bright room, the hum of overhead fluorescent lights buzzing softly in the background. It felt like an ordinary office, bland, clinical, devoid of any warmth or comfort. There were no windows, no signs of life, just a faintly metallic scent that reminded him of hospital hallways. It was the kind of place that seemed designed to make you feel insignificant. Before him, behind a sleek white desk, sat a woman, a receptionist, if one could call her that. She was dressed in a long flowing robe that looked almost too smooth, too perfect, as if it had been stitched together in another world entirely. Her face was blank, a calm mask with no discernible features, but her eyes, those eyes held a knowing distance, a quiet authority. Father Nolan, she said in a voice that was both soft and metallic, like a recorded message played over a speaker. Welcome. You have arrived at your designated afterlife evaluation session. Please take a seat. The words didn't register immediately. Father Nolan blinked, his mind grasping for something, anything, that would help him understand how he had arrived here. But it was all so unreal. He couldn't remember how he had passed from his life to this place. Just that one moment, he had been praying in his private chapel, and the next he was here, standing before this blank receptionist in an afterlife waiting room. He took a step forward, his shoes clicking against the cold, gleaming floor. The chair was unnaturally pristine, its surface unmarked, untouched. He sat down, his fingers gripping the arms of the chair, and his mind began to race. I know you must have many questions, Father, the receptionist continued, her voice as emotionless as the room itself. But first, let me explain where you are. This is the threshold, a neutral space where souls are evaluated for their worthiness to proceed in their journey. It is neither a place of reward nor punishment, but a waiting room for those who must be assessed. Father Nolan nodded absently, trying to gather his bearings. Assessed? He murmured to himself. This was not what he had expected. He had imagined some grand heavenly domain, or perhaps a fiery descent into damnation. But this was nothing like that. It was empty. You will be evaluated by the afterlife arbiter, she explained, offering no further clarification. The arbiter will assess your life's actions, your decisions, and your understanding of the consequences of those actions. Whether you move forward or return will depend on the arbiter's judgment. Father Nolan blinked again, feeling a slow knot of unease form in his chest. Assess my life? He wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but surely it was just a formality. He had done his duty, hadn't he? He had followed the rules. He had kept his vows, hadn't he? He had always been a good priest, a good man. He counseled his parishioners wisely, helped them through difficult times. He had never wavered in his faith. As the receptionist continued speaking, Father Nolan's mind drifted, the sense of dread creeping in around the edges of his thoughts. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing on the memories of his life. He had given so much of himself to the church, dedicated himself to its teachings, to the betterment of his flock. He had been a beacon of light, a guide for the lost and the broken. He had spent decades counseling, listening to confessions, offering advice. Surely that counted for something, didn't it? He reminded himself once more that he had kept his vows, vows that had bound him to a life of service, a life of selflessness. He had given up his own desires, his own pleasures, to serve God. He had avoided the temptations of the world, always choosing the righteous path. He had protected the faith, and in doing so, he had protected the people. His thoughts drifted back to the faces of those he had helped, those who had sought his guidance, the troubled souls, the broken-hearted. He had offered them comfort, given them wisdom, and led them toward a better life. He had never faltered. His work had been good. He was good. The guilt, the doubt, the nagging sense that something had been left undone tried to rise within him, but he pushed it back. It was a fleeting thought, an uncomfortable itch that could be ignored. He had done his best. I have done what was right, he told himself, repeating the words in his head like a prayer. A soft chime rang through the air, breaking the silence, and pulled him from his thoughts. The receptionist stood, her face still unreadable. The afterlife arbiter will see you now, she said simply, her voice betraying no emotion. Please follow me. Father Nolan rose to his feet, his heart now beating a little faster. He had never been one to fear judgment. He had always believed in his actions, in his choices. But the sterile air around him, the emptiness of this place, it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He followed the receptionist as she led him down a corridor, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the unnervingly quiet space. At the end of the hall, a door stood, stark and imposing. The door opened with a soft hiss, revealing the figure waiting inside. It was then that Father Nolan's breath caught in his chest. The afterlife arbiter stood in the doorway, waiting to evaluate him. The arbiter's presence seemed to fill the room, calm, composed, and unyielding. And as Father Nolan stepped forward, his heart thundering in his chest, the arbiter's eyes met his, and with a voice that sounded both distant and omnipresent, the arbiter spoke the words that would begin his evaluation. Father Nolan, your time has come. Father Nolan stepped into the room, the air around him feeling colder than before. The arbiter stood behind a sleek glass desk, its surface reflecting the sterile light of the room. The arbiter's figure remained still, almost statuesque, as Father Nolan took a seat across from it. The silence stretched for a moment, an oppressive weight that made the room feel even more vast, even more distant. Nolan's heart beat in his chest like a drum, but he kept his eyes forward, fighting the urge to look away. This was what he had come here for, the assessment, the evaluation. After a moment, the arbiter spoke, its voice resonating in the otherwise quiet space. Father Michael Nolan, the arbiter began, its tone unwavering and neutral. You have arrived at this point in your existence to be evaluated. Before we proceed, we must look back at your life, at the choices you made, and the paths you followed. You believe yourself to be a good man. You have lived a life of service, of dedication to the church. Let us begin with your actions. Tell me, what do you see when you look back? Father Nolan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat for a moment. Good man, he thought, a man of service. He could hear his own voice in his mind, the words he had spoken in life, the justifications he had always held close. I see a life devoted to God, to helping others, he said, his voice steady, but with a touch of uncertainty creeping in. I served my parishioners with compassion. I offered counsel to those in need. I kept my vows, lived according to the faith. I did what I thought was right. I helped people. The arbiter's eyes never wavered as it listened, its gaze neither kind nor accusatory, simply observing. And what of the people you helped, Father Nolan? The arbiter asked, its voice cold but inquisitive. Did you truly help them? Or did you, in your pursuit of righteousness, leave others to suffer? Father Nolan flinched, the question sinking into him like a weight. What did the arbiter mean by that? He had done everything he could, hadn't he? He quickly brushed off the thought, grasping at the parts of his life he knew were good, the moments that were beyond reproach. I counseled families in distress, Nolan continued, the words flowing more easily now. I helped troubled youth find their way. I was there for my parishioners in their darkest hours. I led the masses with grace. I comforted the grieving. I worked tirelessly for the community. The arbiter nodded, its expression unreadable. Your record shows all of this, the arbiter said, flipping through a file that Nolan could not see. And yet, it also shows something else, a pattern that may not be as easily reconciled with your perception of yourself. Father Nolan felt a tightness in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He had expected the arbiter to commend him, to affirm his role in the church, to tell him that he had done well. But the arbiter continued, its voice steady, almost detached. You have assisted the vulnerable, Father Nolan. You have made efforts to comfort those who needed it most. Yet there is one recurring theme in your life that we must address. One issue that has haunted you for years. Father Nolan's stomach twisted. The accusations. The allegations against Hale. I don't understand, he stammered, struggling to keep his composure. What do you mean? I did my duty. I followed the rules. I reported the accusations. I recommended the reassignment. The arbiter didn't respond immediately. Instead, it lifted a hand and waved it in the air. A screen materialized before Nolan's eyes, showing images of his past, the faces of his parishioners, the moments he had considered successful, counseling sessions, baptisms, weddings. But then the images shifted, showing the faces of children, the same children who had accused Father Hale. Nolan's chest tightened as he saw their tear-streaked faces, their terrified expressions. The arbiter's voice cut through the silence once more. You recommended Father Hale's reassignment 6 times, Father Nolan. 6 separate occasions. Each time you did what you thought was right, shuffling him from one parish to another, rather than confronting the truth of his actions. Why? Was it for the good of the church? Or was it because you feared the consequences? Father Nolan's heart raced. He knew this was coming. He could feel the truth in the room, pressing against him from all sides. He had known all along that something was wrong. He had felt it in his gut. But he had convinced himself it was all for the greater good. I did what was required of me, he said, his voice shaking now. I followed protocol. There was no proof, only accusations. And the church needed to maintain its reputation. I didn't have a choice. The arbiter's gaze softened, but it was not an expression of sympathy. It was a recognition of his excuses. You speak of duty, Father Nolan, the arbiter said slowly. But duty is not always enough. You allowed fear and the system to guide you rather than confronting the real consequences of your choices. You protected the institution, but did you protect the children? Father Nolan's chest felt tight, the air thin in the room. The words hung in the silence, louder than any accusation. His eyes stung, but he held them steady. He began, but the words stuck in his throat. His mind raced. What had he truly done? What had he allowed to happen? The arbiter gave him no time to answer. Instead, it continued, its voice unwavering, unmoved by his hesitation. Good men are not defined by their intentions alone, Father Nolan. They are defined by their actions, by the lives they touch, and the choices they make. You have helped many, yes, but you have also ignored the suffering of others. You chose to believe the system over the truth, and now you must confront the cost of that decision. Father Nolan's breath caught in his throat, his chest tightening. He leaned forward in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. His heart was racing, and he could feel a cold sweat prickling on the back of his neck. I never hurt a child in my life, he exclaimed, his voice rising with an urgency that betrayed his panic. I kept my vows. I served the church. I did what I was supposed to do. The words tumbled out before he could stop them, desperate and defensive. He didn't understand. Why is this happening, he thought. I followed the rules. I did my duty. The arbiter remained still, its expression as impassive as ever, its voice cool and steady. Your actions, Father Nolan, did not need to directly cause harm for harm to occur, the arbiter said, the words cutting through the air like ice. You speak of your own purity, of your vows and your service, but your decisions, your choices, those have consequences whether you see them or not. By reassigning Father Hale 6 times, you chose to ignore the truth. You failed to protect those children, Father Nolan, and in doing so, you allowed the cycle of abuse to continue. Father Nolan's eyes widened, the weight of the arbiter's words settling into him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, constricted. This wasn't me, he thought. I didn't hurt them. But even as the thought surfaced, doubt crept in. He had known, and yet he had done nothing. He had believed the reassignment was the right course, the best course. He had trusted in the system, in the hierarchy, in the church's decision-making, instead of confronting the reality of what was happening under his nose. You protected the institution, Father Nolan, the arbiter continued, but at what cost? You chose not to act. You chose to move him around, hoping the problem would be solved somewhere else. And by doing so, you allowed the abuse to spread 6 times, 6 children. The words felt like poison. They made him dizzy, and the room seemed to narrow around him. He tried to steady himself, but his breath grew shallow. I didn't know, he said weakly. I couldn't have known it would go that far. I followed the guidelines. I didn't have proof. And what about the children, Father Nolan? The arbiter's voice was piercing, unrelenting. They had proof. They had voices. But you chose to silence them, to protect the institution. You didn't ask the questions that needed to be asked, and you didn't seek the truth. Father Nolan flinched, but the arbiter pressed on, its voice now like the force of a tidal wave. You never saw the victims. You saw the accusations, the reports. But you didn't see their faces. You didn't see their tears, their broken lives. You never looked beyond the surface of your duties to ask what was truly happening. By reassigning Father Hale, you allowed him to return, to hurt again. Nolan's mind raced, the thoughts colliding with one another. I didn't hurt them, he repeated in his head, as if the mantra would shield him. But the truth, no matter how he tried to deny it, was slowly unraveling before him. He remembered the parents who had come to him, the ones who had trusted him, who had asked for his help. He remembered the confusion in their eyes when he reassigned Father Hale without ever really questioning it. I thought I was doing the right thing, he thought, clinging to the justification. It was just a procedure, just protocol. But now, in the cold light of the arbiter's judgment, it didn't seem like enough. You didn't need to have direct contact with the children to harm them, Father Nolan, the arbiter said, its voice cold, final. You failed in your responsibility. Your decisions were complicit in their suffering. Nolan sat back, feeling the air around him thin. The weight of the arbiter's words pressed down on him, suffocating him until the room felt like it was closing in. His thoughts drifted to the children, those 6 faces, those 6 lives that had been shattered, their futures tainted by the very system he had trusted. He could see their eyes, their broken expressions, and he felt the guilt and shame swell inside him. He could no longer deny the truth, no matter how hard he tried. I failed them, he whispered, the words finally escaping his lips. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing over him, pulling him under. I failed them. The arbiter's gaze never left him. It knew that Father Nolan had known all along. And it had known that Nolan would deny the truth, cling to his own righteousness for as long as he could. But now there was no escaping it. He couldn't outrun the truth any longer. He had failed in his responsibility, and the consequences of his inaction were etched in the lives of those children. I should have done something, Nolan continued, his voice trembling. I should have fought harder. I should have. But you didn't, the arbiter interrupted, its voice quiet but firm. You protected the system instead of the children, and now you must live with the truth of that decision. Father Nolan closed his eyes, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him until he could hardly breathe. He had spent his life convincing himself that he had done enough, that he had kept his vows, that he was a good man. But the truth, this truth, was undeniable. He had failed, and now he had to face it. Father Nolan sat motionless in the chair, his mind still reeling from the painful admission he had just made. The room around him remained as cold and sterile as ever, the sterile walls seeming to close in with the weight of his guilt. The arbiter, as unfeeling as before, remained its ever-watchful presence, an impassive observer. You have spoken the truth, Father Nolan, the arbiter said, its voice clear and unwavering. You have admitted the failings of your actions. You have seen the consequences of your choices. But we must now look at your life in its entirety. We must consider all that you have done and all that you have failed to do. Father Nolan's chest tightened. He had expected this moment, the final reckoning, the summing up of his entire existence. But he wasn't ready. He wasn't ready for the judgment of his entire life to be laid bare before him. The arbiter began, its tone clinical, yet somehow distant and solemn. Your service to the church has been long. You have done much that is considered good in the eyes of your faith. You have counseled, you have offered guidance, and you have dedicated yourself to the institution. You believed you were living a righteous life, and in many ways you were. But your righteousness was narrow. Father Nolan clenched his hands in his lap. He had always seen himself as doing the right thing, had believed his path was correct, but now he was being told that his view had been too limited, too self-contained. The arbiter continued, its voice neutral but piercing. You protected the church, Father Nolan, But you did not protect the children. You did not protect those who were the most vulnerable. Your service was to an institution, not to the people it was meant to serve. Your focus was on protocol, on reputation, on maintaining the facade of goodness. And in doing so, you lost sight of the very people your service was meant to protect. Father Nolan's throat tightened and his eyes dropped to his hands. He felt small, insignificant. He had spent his entire life trying to uphold something he thought was righteous, only to be told that he had missed the point entirely. But, the arbiter continued, almost as though reading his thoughts, it's not too late for you to learn. It is not too late to see what you have failed to see. Father Nolan looked up sharply, his heart pounding. What do you mean? The arbiter stood motionless, its gaze fixed on him with an unreadable expression. You cannot move forward, Father Nolan, until you fully understand the impact of your decisions, until you truly understand the harm that your inaction has caused. You must learn from the victim's perspective. Only then can you begin to reconcile your past choices with the responsibilities you neglected. Father Nolan's mind reeled as the words settled in. Learn from the victim's perspective? It felt almost like an impossible request, a perspective so far removed from his own. Victims? How can I learn from them? He asked, the question escaping his lips before he could stop it. What more is there to understand? I know what I did. I know that I failed them. The arbiter's gaze was unwavering, and for the first time, Father Nolan thought he saw something flicker within its expression, perhaps a flicker of empathy, or maybe something darker. You must experience their suffering, the arbiter said quietly. You must walk in their shoes, see the world through their eyes. Only then can you understand the full weight of your actions. Only then can you begin to atone for what you've done. The room seemed to grow colder still. Father Nolan sat in stunned silence, his chest tight with dread. What the arbiter was suggesting was beyond anything he had imagined. To walk in their shoes, to experience what those children had suffered, felt impossible. He had been their shepherd, their guide, their protector. But in the end, he had been just as blind as the system he had defended. And what will happen to me if I don't? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The arbiter's eyes met his, its expression unreadable. If you refuse, Father Nolan, your journey ends here. You will cease to exist. Your failure to evolve, your refusal to face the consequences of your choices, will mean that you have failed the journey toward enlightenment. You will no longer remain. Your soul will be lost, and the chance for redemption will pass forever. Father Nolan's heart sank, a chill sweeping through him at the finality of the arbiter's words. To refuse meant his very existence would cease. There would be no second chance, no afterlife waiting for him to try again. He would simply disappear. The weight of the decision hit him hard, but something deep within him stirred. The truth was, he could not go back. He could not undo what he had done. But this path, however painful, however impossible it seemed, might allow him a chance to confront his mistakes, to finally understand what he had failed to see. It was the only path forward, the only hope for redemption. "I accept," he said softly, the words barely escaping his lips. He felt a lump form in his throat, and a tear slipped down his cheek, though he didn't know when it had started. "I will learn. I will understand." The arbiter's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight shift in its gaze, as though it recognized his choice, as though it could feel the weight of his commitment. "Very well, Father Nolan," the arbiter intoned, its voice calm but final. "Your journey toward enlightenment begins now. Walk in their shoes and learn what you must. Only then will you be ready to move forward." With that, the arbiter gestured, and the room around Father Nolan shifted, the air growing heavier, the walls dissolving. His journey had truly begun. The air in the small shabby house was thick with humidity, and the flickering light from a single bulb cast long distorted shadows across the cramped room. The walls were stained yellow, the edges of the ceiling crumbling with neglect. Every inch of the place felt suffocating, small, cramped, and dirty, as though the very air itself was soaked in despair. There was no comfort here, no warmth. The smell of stale sweat and something foul lingered in the corners. In the center of the room, a woman lay on a worn-out mattress, her breath ragged, her body trembling with each contraction. Her skin was pale, and beads of sweat dotted her forehead as she gripped the stained sheets beneath her. The pain surged through her, each wave of labor seeming to tear her apart. But there was no one to help her, only the sound of her gasps, her desperate cries, and the voice of the man standing beside her. "Stop whining," the man growled, his voice slurred with alcohol, though he was stone-cold sober in his cruelty. He leaned against the door frame, arms folded, watching her struggle without a hint of concern. "Take me to the hospital," she begged, her voice raw, trembling with fear and desperation. Her hands gripped the edge of the mattress, nails digging into the fabric. "Please, please, I need help." He shook his head, his lips curling into a sneer. "Hospital? No, you're fine. Stop making noise. You're just fine." The woman closed her eyes, her breath coming in sharp gasps, the pain intensifying. She couldn't even imagine what it might be like to be held, to have someone, anyone, offer comfort, tenderness, and care. It had never been like that with him. He had never once cared for her, never once made her feel safe. But now she was on the brink of bringing a child into the world. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the pain, focusing on that tiny life that had already kicked and squirmed inside her for months. A baby, a chance for something better, something different. She didn't know how she would protect her, how she would keep her safe from the man standing by the door, but she knew she would try. She would try with every ounce of her being, even if it meant doing it alone. She gasped, her body racked with another contraction. She could feel the pressure building, the undeniable force pulling her towards the birth of this child. This child who had no say in the circumstances of its arrival, who would be born into a world of dirt, neglect, and cruelty. But at least it would be here. At least it would be alive. Almost there, she whispered to herself through clenched teeth, her eyes squeezed shut. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't. Not with her baby so close. Not with the life she had carried for so long about to be born into this world. Her breath hitched as the final wave of pain crashed over her, a sharp, almost unbearable pressure in her body. She bit down on her lips, swallowing the scream that threatened to break free. And then relief. The baby girl emerged, slippery and wet, into the world with a loud cry, tiny hands grasping at the air, her voice a high-pitched wail that filled the room with life. The woman's chest heaved with exhaustion, her body trembling. She reached down with shaky hands, pulling the newborn close, feeling her daughter's tiny heartbeat against her own. She didn't know if she could protect her, didn't know if she could give her the life she deserved. But in that moment, she was alive. Her daughter was alive, and that was all that mattered. But then the silence returned, broken only by the man's voice. "Another girl," he sneered, his tone venomous. "Worthless." He didn't move, didn't step forward to help. He simply stood there as though the birth of a child was nothing more than an inconvenience to him, a burden to be dealt with. He would never understand, never care. His hands would never comfort. His words would never be kind. The woman ignored him, cradling the baby close to her chest, her tears falling freely now. This was her daughter, her hope, and she would protect her, even if it was only with the little strength she had left. As the woman held her daughter, the journey of understanding, the one Father Nolan would now walk, was about to begin in the darkest of places.